Nurse Claire accidentally saves the life of a man suffering from multiple gunshot wounds, never realizing he is Damien Rossi, the most wanted mafia boss in New York. To repay her and protect her from being silenced by his enemies, Damien forces Claire into a fake marriage. You are listening to a story exclusively narrated on the Mafia Romance channel. Relax and step into the world of love stories filled with mystery, emotions, and passion. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to support us. Rain hammered the ambulance bay of St. Augustine's Trauma Centre like 1,000 impatient fists, and Claire Bennett had exactly 4 minutes of quiet left in her life before everything she understood about the world came apart at the seams. She didn't know that yet. She only knew that her coffee had gone cold on the nurse's station counter for the 3rd time that shift, and that Dr. Whitfield was somewhere in Bay 6 arguing with a resident about a chart, and that the fluorescent lights above her buzzed in that particular frequency that made her temples throb after hour 10 of a 12-hour shift. Then the doors blew open. Not swung. Blue. Like something out of a war film, 2 paramedics soaked to the bone, wheeling a gurney with a man on it who should, by every rule of anatomy Claire had spent 6 years memorizing, already be dead. Blood soaked through a jacket that had once been the colour of charcoal silk, now black and wet and glistening under the lights. She counted entry wounds without meaning to. The counting was reflex, drilled into her by 100 trauma rotations, and stopped at 3 because a 4th would have meant something closer to a miracle than a patient. Gunshot wounds times 3, possible 4th, BP's crashing. We lost him twice in transit, the paramedic barked, and Claire's hands were already moving before her brain caught up, snapping gloves on, calling for O negative, calling for Whitfield, calling for a crash cart because the monitor had gone from erratic peaks to the flat, obscene silence of a flatline in the span of one breath. "Who called this in?" someone shouted. "Where's security?" "We need PD notified later," Claire snapped, because there was no later that mattered more than right now, this exact suspended second where a man's heart had stopped beating, and it was her hands, her compressions, her voice counting the rhythm that would decide whether he lived to see another sunrise or became a number in a file nobody would ever read twice. She didn't look at his face, not really. Faces didn't matter in that first blur of motion, only the wound beneath her palms, the blood soaking through gauze faster than she could pack it, the shocking, obscene amount of a human being's life measured out in milliliters on a floor already slick with it. Whitfield arrived, barked orders, and for 6 minutes that felt like 60, Claire Bennett existed only as a set of hands doing the one thing she had trained a decade to do: refuse to let death win. When the monitor finally caught that thin, stuttering blip climbing back into something like a rhythm, the room exhaled as one organism. Claire sat back on her heels, gloves crimson to the wrist, and only then did she let herself look at the face of the man she had just refused to let die. He was, even wrecked, even grey with blood loss, even unconscious with a breathing tube taped crooked to his mouth, beautiful in the particular, dangerous way that made something in Claire's stomach go very still. Black hair, damp with sweat and rain, a jaw carved like it had been designed to be looked at from a distance in dim light by people who would never get close enough to touch it. A scar, old and pale, cutting through one eyebrow. "Get him prepped for OR2, Whitfield said, already stripping his gloves.
"Bennett, good work. Damn good work."
She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt the cold, crawling certainty of a woman who has just picked up something she was never meant to touch. Two men in suits that cost more than her yearly salary appeared at the edge of the trauma bay less than 10 minutes later, and they did not ask questions the way police did. They didn't flash badges. They stood very still and very quiet near the door, watching her with the flat, unblinking attention of men used to being obeyed. And when she asked, foolishly, because adrenaline makes fools of even careful people, who the patient was, one of them said only, "A friend." "Friends don't usually arrive with 3 bullet holes," Claire said, because exhaustion had scraped away some of her filter. The man's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "This one does." By the time hospital security finally noticed the two strangers loitering in a restricted corridor and moved to question them, they had already gone. And so, impossibly, had the patient's chart, scrubbed from the system as though he had never been wheeled through those doors at all. No name, no insurance, no record. Claire stood in the hallway outside OR2 at 2 in the morning, blood dried to a rust-brown crust on her scrub sleeves, and felt, for the first time in her career, the particular vertigo of having saved a life that was never supposed to exist on paper. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself that in 3 days she wouldn't remember his face, that this was simply another Tuesday in an ER that swallowed tragedies whole and forgot them by dawn. She was wrong. She would remember every line of that face for the rest of her life. Because in 6 days, Damien Rossi would walk back into it, and nothing about Claire Bennett's carefully ordinary existence would ever be safe again. The man didn't die. Claire knew that much because the hospital grapevine, nurses were worse gossips than any tabloid, whispered that the John Doe from Bay 3 had been transferred out against all medical advice less than 18 hours after emergency surgery, wheeled out by private ambulance in the dead of night, with 2 armed men flanking the gurney like it carried a head of state. No name, no forwarding address, no trace, except for the manila envelope that appeared on Claire's locker 3 days later, sealed with wax like something out of another century, containing a single cashier's cheque for an amount that made her hands shake, and no note at all. She didn't cash it. She locked it in her sock drawer instead, because something about accepting money from a man who erased his own hospital chart felt like signing a contract she hadn't read the terms of. It didn't matter. The world had already noticed her. It started small. A black sedan idling across from her apartment building 2 nights running, engine off, exhaust curling in the cold like a held breath. A man at the bodega on the corner who bought a coffee and didn't drink it, who watched her reflection in the window glass instead of his phone. Claire told herself she was being paranoid. Nurses who work trauma developed a certain flavour of hypervigilance, an occupational hazard, Dr. Whitfield called it once, half joking. But paranoia didn't usually leave a business card with no name on it, just a phone number, tucked under her windshield wiper on a Thursday morning in the rain. She called it, because curiosity was a disease she'd never been cured of. "You shouldn't have saved him," said a voice on the other end, female, clipped, accented in a way Claire couldn't quite place. "You understand that, don't you? There are people who would have paid a great deal for that man not to walk out of your hospital breathing." "Who is this?" "A friend, giving you a warning you didn't ask for. Stop asking questions about the patient in Bay 3. Burn the check. Change your locks. A pause, weighted with something that might have been pity. And pray he doesn't decide you're worth protecting, Miss Bennet, because that would be so much worse than being forgotten. The line went dead before Claire could ask how the woman knew her name. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table with every light in the apartment on, a butcher knife within reach on the counter, like it would do a damn bit of good against whatever kind of world had just brushed its fingers against the edge of hers. And she turned the words over and over, pray he doesn't decide you're worth protecting. She changed her locks the next morning anyway. It felt like the only sane thing left to do. For a week, nothing happened. The black sedan didn't return. The man at the bodega vanished back into the ordinary churn of Brooklyn strangers. Claire started, cautiously, to let herself believe it was over. That whoever he was, whatever world he belonged to, had swallowed him back up and closed the door behind him. And that she would go back to being an anonymous ER nurse, whose only brush with danger was a resident who couldn't suture straight. Then, on a Tuesday night, with rain sheeting sideways against her windows, exactly like the night it had all begun, someone knocked on her apartment door at 11:40 p.m. She looked through the peephole and felt her heart stop in a way it hadn't since her own father's funeral. It was him. Upright, dressed in a black overcoat that made him look less like a man and more like an eclipse, some dark, total thing that swallowed the light around it. The scar through his eyebrow was the only proof he was the same broken body she'd knelt over 6 days earlier, because everything else about him had healed into something terrifyingly composed. His eyes, when she finally worked up the courage to open the door on the chain, were the colour of good whiskey and twice as dangerous. "Miss Bennet," he said, and his voice was low, unhurried, the voice of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise it to be obeyed. "My name is Damien Rossi. I believe you saved my life." Claire's hand tightened on the door chain. "I think you should leave." "I think," Damien said, with the faint, humourless curve of a smile, "that you already know I'm not the kind of man who does what he's told to do. May I come in?" "We have a great deal to discuss, and very little time to discuss it in." Behind him, at the end of the hallway, she caught the shape of another black sedan through the stairwell window, engine running, exhaust curling in the cold like a held breath. She let him in only because the alternative, leaving him standing in a public hallway where anyone might see him, felt, in some instinctive animal part of her brain, more dangerous than whatever he had come to say. Damien Rossi filled her small living room the way a wolf fills a room built for house cats, not through size alone, though he was tall enough to make her ceiling feel low, but through some quality of stillness that made her furniture look flimsy by comparison. He didn't sit until she gestured to the chair, and even then he sat like a man choosing to lower himself, not like a man accepting hospitality. "You want to know who I am," he said. "I want to know why there are men watching my apartment." "Those are the same answer." He studied her with an attention that made her skin prickle, the same clinical thoroughness she used on patients, except turned back on her, and she didn't like how exposed it made her feel. "My name means something in this city. It means something to the men who put 4 bullets in me outside a restaurant on Mulberry Street, and it will mean something to them now that they know I survived. and that I survived because of you. I'm a nurse. I save people. That's the job. Not people like me. Something flickered behind his eyes, gone before she could name it. The men who did this to me will assume, correctly, that I owe you a debt. In my world, Miss Bennet, debts are currency, and currency gets stolen. He let that settle into the room like smoke. Which means you are now, whether you asked for it or not, a target. Not because of anything you did, because of what you know how to do, and who you did it for. Claire's mouth had gone dry. The woman who called me. She works for you. She works against the people who would silence you. There's a difference, though I understand it might not feel like one. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and the movement brought him close enough that she could see the fine, healing pink line at his throat where a chest tube had been. I have a proposition. You will not like it. I would ask you to consider it anyway, because the alternative is considerably worse. I'm listening. Marry me. The words landed in the small apartment like a dropped glass, and for a moment Claire simply stared at him, waiting for the joke to reveal itself, the way you wait for a punchline that never comes. You're insane. I'm protecting an asset, Damien said, and something about the coldness of the phrase, asset, cut deeper than she expected. The men who tried to kill me will not touch a Rossi wife. It isn't sentiment, it's law, older than any court in this country, and it is the only law that will keep you breathing through the next 6 months while I dismantle the people who want you silenced. A marriage in name. Nothing more required of you. My name, my protection, my resources, in exchange for the appearance of a bond that isn't real. I have a life, Claire said, and hated how thin her voice sounded. A job, friends. I'm not going to disappear into whatever this is, because you've decided I'm collateral damage in your war. You already are collateral damage, Miss Bennet. I'm simply offering you armour. He rose, and the room seemed to exhale around his absence of movement, the way a held breath released finds relief in its own departure. I won't force you. I'm not that kind of monster. Whatever you may have heard, whatever you may come to believe. But I'd ask you to look out your window before you refuse. She didn't want to. She did, anyway. 2 black sedans now, not one, parked at either end of her street, and standing beneath the sodium glow of a street lamp directly across from her building, a man she didn't recognize, staring up at her window without any pretense of hiding that he was doing exactly that. That is not one of mine, Damien said quietly, from just behind her shoulder, close enough that she felt the warmth of him against her back like a held threat. That is a message. They know where you live, Miss Bennet. They knew before I did. I would ask you again, but I suspect you already have your answer. Claire's hands were shaking on the windowsill. If I say yes, she said, not turning around, what happens to my life? It becomes mine to protect, Damien said, for as long as it takes to make you safe again. Nothing more. I give you my word. She would learn, in the months that followed, exactly how much a Rossi's word was worth, and exactly how catastrophically it would fail to remain the simple, bloodless bargain he had promised her that night. But standing at her window, with a stranger's silhouette burned into her retinas, Claire Bennet said the only word left available to her. Yes. The wedding was arranged with the ruthless efficiency of a hostile takeover. Within 72 hours, Claire had signed papers she barely had time to read, been fitted for a dress by a woman who never once made eye contact, and been photographed by a society reporter who called it the most private public wedding New York has seen in a decade. A phrase that made Damien's jaw tighten in a way Claire was already learning to read as anger disguised as calm. She hadn't expected the anger. She hadn't expected in truth to feel anything about Damien Rossi beyond fear and a kind of clinical fascination, the way you might study a dangerous animal from behind reinforced glass. But in the small windows between the chaos, a car ride here, a silent dinner there, both of them too exhausted to perform civility, she began to notice things that didn't fit the monster the tabloids had already started calling him. He didn't raise his voice at his staff. He remembered, without being told twice, that she took her coffee black. When a photographer got too close outside the courthouse where they filed their marriage license, Damien didn't threaten the man. He simply stepped, without seeming to hurry, into the exact space between the camera and Claire's face, and stayed there until the car door closed. "You didn't have to do that," she said, once they were moving, the privacy glass sliding up between them and the driver. "Do what?" "Block the shot. I could have handled a photographer." Damien looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression, not quite softness, but the ghost of where softness might once have lived before whatever had hardened him into this, made her breath catch. "You didn't ask for cameras. You didn't ask for any of this. The least I can offer you is the illusion of choice in the parts that don't matter." "And the parts that do matter?" "Those," he said, turning to look out the window, "I'm afraid I've already taken from you. I won't pretend otherwise. I find I dislike lying to you, which is inconvenient given how much of what I do requires exactly that." It was the closest thing to an apology he had offered her, and it landed harder than she expected it to. The wedding itself was held in a private chapel on the grounds of a Rossi property upstate, attended by perhaps 30 people, every one of them radiating the particular watchfulness of guests who had come to assess a threat rather than celebrate a union. Claire recognized none of them, except briefly the woman who had called her weeks earlier, introduced only as Elena, Damien's cousin and apparently the closest thing to a confidant he possessed. "You're braver than you look," Elena murmured, adjusting Claire's veil with brisk, efficient hands backstage. "Or more foolish. I haven't decided which." "Is there a difference in this family?" Elena's mouth curved, almost fond. "Rarely." Damien's brother Nico stood at the front of the chapel throughout the ceremony, with an expression that made Claire's skin crawl. Not hostile exactly, but assessing, the way a man might look at a business asset he suspected was overvalued. When the officiant pronounced them married, Nico was the first to approach, kissing Claire's cheek with lips that felt like ice. "Welcome to the family, Mrs. Rossi," he said, and the title landed on her like a brand. "I do hope you understand what you've married into." "I understand enough," Claire said, meeting his eyes, refusing to let him see how badly her hands wanted to shake. Something shifted in Nico's expression. Surprise, maybe, or the beginning of respect. "Perhaps you do," he murmured, and moved on before she could ask him to clarify. That night, in the penthouse that would become her prison and her sanctuary in equal measure, Damien showed her to a bedroom at the far end of the apartment from his own. "This is yours," he said. "Locks on the inside. I won't come in unless you ask me to. And if I never ask? Something moved behind his eyes. Restraint, she would learn later. The particular discipline of a man holding a wolf on a very short leash. Then you never ask, he said. That was always the agreement, Mrs. Rossi. I intend to keep it. He turned to leave. At the door, though, he paused, one hand braced against the frame, and looked back at her with an intensity that made the hair on her arms rise. For what it's worth, he said quietly, you did save my life. I haven't forgotten that. Whatever else you come to believe about me in the months ahead, I want you to know that I haven't, and never will, forget that. Then he was gone, and Claire Bennett, Claire Rossi now on paper if nothing else, stood alone in a bedroom bigger than her old apartment, wearing a wedding ring worth more than her annual salary, married to a stranger who terrified her, and, infinitely more dangerously, had already begun to fascinate her. 3 weeks into her new life, Claire discovered that being Mrs. Damien Rossi meant learning an entirely new language, one spoken in silences, in the careful placement of bodyguards, in the particular way a room full of dangerous men would go quiet when her husband walked into it. The Vesper was Damien's, though his name appeared on no license, no deed, no piece of paper that could tie him to the club that occupied the top 3 floors of a converted warehouse in the meat-packing district. Claire had resisted the invitation to accompany him for 2 weeks before finally relenting, mostly out of the crushing boredom of a penthouse that felt, some days, more like a beautifully appointed cell than a home. You don't have to come, Damien had said, adjusting his cufflinks in the mirror while she watched from the doorway, already regretting the black dress Eleanor had insisted she buy. It isn't a requirement of the marriage. I'm aware of what is and isn't a requirement of this marriage, Claire said, more sharply than she intended. I'd like to leave the apartment occasionally without feeling like I'm breaking parole. Something flickered across his face, amusement maybe, or the closest thing to it she'd seen from him. Then come, stay close to me. And Claire? It was the first time he'd used her first name since the wedding, and it landed with more weight than it should have. Don't wander. Not tonight. The Vesper at 11 p.m. was a cathedral of dark velvet and darker money, and Claire understood within minutes of walking through its doors that every single person in the room knew exactly who Damien Rossi was, and exactly what it meant that he had a woman on his arm for the first time in longer than any of them could remember. He's never brought anyone here, a woman murmured to her friend at the bar, not quite quietly enough. Not once, not in 6 years. Claire filed that away like a splinter she'd have to dig out later. She lasted almost an hour before a man approached her at the bar while Damien was pulled into a low, tense conversation with 2 men she didn't recognize across the room. Expensive suit, easy smile, the particular confidence of someone who had never once in his life been told no. You must be the wife everyone's talking about, he said, sliding onto the stool beside her without invitation. Anthony Vitali. I do a great deal of business with your husband. Or did, before he decided marriage suited him better than sense. I don't discuss my husband's business. Smart girl. His eyes travelled over her in a way that made her skin crawl, slow and assessing. Tell me, does he treat you well? Because a woman as lovely as you deserves better than being locked in a tower for a man's convenience. I'd say that's none of your concern. Everything about Damien Rossi is my concern, sweetheart. That's the business we're in. She felt Damien before she saw him, A shift in the air, the sudden and total silence of every conversation within 10 feet, and then his hand closed around the back of Anthony Vitali's collar with a precision that spoke of violence held in careful, deliberate restraint. "Anthony," Damien said, his voice pleasant in a way that made the hair on Claire's arms stand up. "I don't recall inviting you to speak to my wife." "Just being friendly, Damien. No harm meant." "There's a great deal of harm meant, and we both know it." Damien's grip didn't loosen. "You have exactly 10 seconds to remove yourself from this bar before I stop being polite about it." Anthony left. Damien didn't relax until he was gone from sight entirely, and even then the tension in his shoulders didn't fully unwind. It simply redirected itself toward Claire, his hand coming to rest at the small of her back with a possessiveness that startled her more than the confrontation had. "You didn't have to threaten him," Claire said, once they were in the car, the club's neon fading behind them. "He wasn't going to stop at conversation." "You don't know that." "I know Anthony Vitali," Damien said, his jaw tight, staring straight ahead. "I know exactly what he wanted, and it wasn't conversation, and I will not—" He stopped himself, visibly, the way a man reins in a horse at the edge of a cliff. "I will not have him near you. That isn't negotiable, Claire. Whatever else about this marriage remains open for debate, that isn't." She should have argued. Some part of her, the independent, capable ER nurse who had spent a career refusing to be told what she could and couldn't handle, wanted to argue. But another part of her, the part she was only beginning to acknowledge, noticed the tightness in his knuckles where his hand had fisted against his thigh, the barely restrained violence simmering beneath his composed exterior, and understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that it wasn't possessiveness alone driving him. It was jealousy. Raw, unpolished, entirely unwanted jealousy, from a man who had promised her a marriage in name only. "Damien," she said quietly, and he turned to look at her, something naked and unguarded in his eyes, for just a moment, before the mask slid back into place. "Thank you. For tonight." "Don't thank me," he said, looking away again, out the window, at the city sliding past in ribbons of gold and red. "I'm not doing this out of kindness." But his hand, when it found hers on the seat between them, closed around it like something that had no intention of letting go, and neither of them said another word for the rest of the drive home. The weeks that followed changed the temperature of the penthouse by degrees so small Claire almost didn't notice them accumulating. It started with small things. Damien began appearing in the kitchen at the same hour she made her morning coffee, though he'd never once done so before, and though he claimed each time it was coincidence, Claire began to suspect coincidence had very little to do with a man who scheduled his entire empire down to the minute. He started asking about her shifts, not with the clinical detachment of a man tracking an asset, but with something that sounded, increasingly, like genuine curiosity about the life she'd left behind to marry him. "Tell me about a day," he said one evening, uncharacteristically over a dinner neither of them had expected to share. "A normal one, before all this." Claire studied him across the table, searching for the trick in the question and finding, for once, none. "There's nothing glamorous about it. 12-hour shifts, bad coffee, patients who scream at you for things that aren't your fault, and the ones who thank you like you hung the moon for doing your job." "Which do you prefer?" "Neither. Both." She turned her wineglass slowly by its stem. "I liked knowing at the end of the day that I'd done something that mattered. even when it was small, even when nobody remembered my name. I remember your name, Damien said, quiet. And something in the way he said it, low, deliberate, like a confession he hadn't meant to make, made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear. That's different. You'd be dead without it. That's exactly why it isn't different. He set his own glass down, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked almost young, the composure stripped back to reveal something rawer underneath.
Do you know how many people have tried to kill me, Claire? How many nights I've gone to sleep certain I wouldn't wake up? I stopped expecting anyone to care whether I lived or died a long time ago. It's easier that way. Cleaner. His eyes met hers, and there was something devastating in them. Something that looked almost like grief. And then a stranger, with blood on her hands up to the elbow, refused to let me go. I think about that more than I should. Claire didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and the silence between them stretched taut and electric, full of every word neither of them was ready to speak. It was Elena who finally forced the issue, cornering Claire in the penthouse's private gym 3 days later, while Damien was in a meeting downtown.
"You've noticed, haven't you?" Elena said, not bothering with preamble, watching Claire finish a set on the treadmill with the sharp, assessing eyes of a woman who missed nothing. "Noticed what?" "Don't insult us both." Elena crossed her arms. "I've known Damien since we were children. I have never, not once, not with any woman before you, seen him look at someone the way he looks at you. It terrifies me, honestly. He spent 15 years building walls so high nothing could climb them, and you did it in 6 weeks without even trying. This is supposed to be a fake marriage. Is it?" Elena's smile was thin, knowing, not unkind. "Tell that to the men he's had watching your hospital every shift you've worked since the wedding. Tell that to the security detail he doubled after Anthony Vitali so much as looked at you sideways. Fake marriages don't usually come with a man losing sleep over whether his wife's coffee is too hot." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Be careful, Claire. Not of him. Of what happens to both of you if you let yourselves feel what I think you're already feeling, in a world built to punish exactly that kind of weakness." That night, unable to sleep, Claire found herself standing outside Damien's study long after midnight, drawn by the low light beneath the door and the particular restlessness that had settled into her bones since Elena's warning. She knocked before she could talk herself out of it. He opened the door in shirt sleeves, tie long since discarded, looking more unguarded than she'd ever seen him. A man caught between the armour of his empire and whatever remained of himself underneath it. Claire. Her name in his mouth still did something to her she refused to examine too closely. "It's late. I couldn't sleep." "Neither could I." He stepped back, wordlessly, an invitation, and she crossed the threshold into a room lined with books she doubted he had time to read, and a single lamp casting everything in gold. "Is something wrong?" "I don't know," she admitted, and it was the truest thing she'd said to him since the night she'd agreed to marry him. "I think I'm starting to forget which parts of this are supposed to be pretend." Damien went very still. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to something rough, something that scraped against her composure like a match against stone. "Then we're in the same trouble, Mrs. Rossi."
because I stopped pretending a long time ago, and I have no idea what to do about it." Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke again. But the space between them, in that gold-lit room past midnight, had shrunk to something dangerously, deliciously small. And both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, that whatever came next would change everything they'd promised each other at the start. Neither of them crossed the last few feet of distance that night. Damien stepped back first, jaw tight, and murmured something about it being late, and Claire retreated to her own wing of the penthouse, with her pulse hammering and her hands unsteady on the doorframe, furious at herself for wanting something she had no business wanting from a marriage built on paper and danger. But restraint, Claire was learning, only worked as a strategy until the world stopped cooperating with it. The threat arrived on a Thursday, disguised as an invitation. A gala at the Contessa, one of the city's oldest hotels, hosted by a family whose name Claire recognised only because Damien's shoulders had gone rigid the moment the embossed card arrived. The Moretti family. Old rivals. Older grudges. "We don't have to go," Damien said, turning the invitation over in his hands like it might bite him. Refusing would look like fear. His eyes snapped to hers, something like surprise flickering across his face. "You've been paying attention. I've been living in your world for 2 months. I'd be a fool not to." He studied her for a long moment, and whatever he saw satisfied something in him, because the tension in his jaw eased fractionally. "Then we go. But you stay within arm's reach all night. I mean that literally, Claire, not a suggestion." The Contessa's ballroom that night was a war fought entirely in smiles and champagne, and Claire understood within the first 10 minutes that every alliance and betrayal in the room was being conducted in a language of glances and careful positioning that she was only beginning to learn to read. Damien moved through it like a blade through silk, all controlled elegance, his hand never leaving the small of her back for longer than it took to shake another man's hand. It was Nico who caused the trouble in the end, not out of malice toward Claire, but because that was simply the shape Nico's ambition had always taken. Opportunistic, restless, hungry for a throne he didn't yet have the patience to build honestly. She overheard it by accident, ducking into an alcove to escape the crush of the dance floor, and found Nico deep in conversation with a man she didn't recognise, their voices low, but not quite low enough. If something were to happen to Damien, the wife inherits nothing. The marriage was never even consummated, from what I understand. It would be simple to have it annulled, posthumously, if the timing were... Claire's blood went cold, and she must have made some small sound because Nico's head snapped toward the alcove, his expression shifting instantly into something smooth and unbothered. "Claire, enjoying the party?" "I heard you," she said, before she could stop herself. "You're planning something against your own brother." "I'm having a conversation at a party. You should be more careful about what you think you overhear, sister-in-law." His smile didn't reach his eyes. This world isn't kind to people who ask questions they aren't equipped to survive the answers to. She found Damien within minutes, and the moment he saw her face, whatever composure he'd been maintaining evaporated entirely. "What happened?" She told him, every word. And she watched something in him go from controlled to lethal in the space of a single breath. Not loud, not violent in the way she might have expected, but quiet in a way that was infinitely more frightening. The stillness of a man calculating exactly how many ways he could destroy someone without lifting a hand. "Get the car," he told his security detail, his voice flat. "We're leaving." In the car, the privacy glass raised, Damien sat rigid beside her, hands fisted on his knees, and Claire watched him fight some internal battle she couldn't fully see the shape of. "He's your brother," she finally said. "He's ambitious. There's a difference between the two that he's never understood." Damien's voice was tight, controlled violence barely leashed. "I should have dealt with him years ago. I let it go because he's blood, and blood is supposed to mean something in this family, whatever else it costs us." He turned to look at her, and the naked fear in his expression stole her breath. "He would use you to get to me, Claire. Do you understand that? Not because he hates you, because you're the only thing I've ever cared about protecting more than my own life. And he knows it." "Damien, I need you to understand what that means." His hand found her jaw, tilting her face toward him with a gentleness that contradicted the desperation in his eyes. "It means I can't lose you. Not to Nico, not to the Morettis, not to anyone who might think you're a weakness worth exploiting. And I don't know how to protect you from that without—" He stopped, breathing hard, close enough now that she could feel his breath against her lips. "Without admitting that this stopped being pretend for me a long time ago." "It stopped being pretend for me too," Claire whispered, and the words broke something open between them that neither of them had the strength left to close. The kiss, when it came, was not gentle. It was two people who had spent months building walls only to watch them collapse in a single instant, all restraint burned away by fear and jealousy and the terrible, consuming relief of finally admitting what they'd both refused to name. Damien's hand fisted in her hair, and Claire's fingers curled into the lapels of his jacket, and the car sped through the New York night, carrying two people who had just crossed a line neither of them could uncross. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathless, Damien pressed his forehead against hers, his voice ragged in a way she'd never heard it before. "I'm not going to be able to let you go now," he said. "I want you to know that. Whatever happens next, I'm not going to be able to let you go." They didn't speak of the kiss again for 3 days, both of them circling it like a wound too raw to touch. But something had shifted permanently in the air of the penthouse, a charge that hadn't existed before, that made every accidental brush of hands in the kitchen, every lingering glance across the dinner table, feel like a held breath waiting to be released. It was Claire who finally broke the silence, finding Damien on the terrace one night, a glass of scotch untouched at his elbow, staring out at the city lights with the particular stillness of a man lost somewhere in his own past. "You disappear," she said, joining him at the railing, "even when you're standing right in front of me." Damien didn't look at her. "Old habit." "Tell me about it. The habit. Where it started." For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer, that she'd asked for something he wasn't willing to give, the way he'd guarded every piece of his history since the day she'd met him. But then he exhaled, slow and unsteady, and began to speak in a voice she'd never heard from him before, stripped of all its usual armour. "I was 19 when my father was killed. Shot in front of me, in this city, by a man he'd trusted for 20 years. His hands tightened on the railing. I watched him die on a sidewalk,
2 blocks from where we're standing right now, and I understood, in that moment, that trust was a luxury men like me couldn't afford.
So I stopped. Trusting. Feeling. Anything that could be used as a weapon against me. He turned to look at her finally, and the rawness in his eyes stole the breath from her lungs. I built an empire on that lesson, Claire. I became exactly the kind of man my father should have been if he'd wanted to survive. Cold, untouchable, alone. And now? Now I have a wife who ran toward a dying man instead of away from him. And I don't know what to do with the fact that she terrifies me more than any enemy I've ever faced. He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear with a tenderness that contradicted every hardened line of his face. I don't know how to be the man you deserve, Claire. I only know how to be the man this world made me into. And I'm terrified that isn't enough for you. Let me decide that, Claire said softly. You don't get to make that choice for me, too. Something broke open in his expression. Relief, maybe, or the particular vulnerability of a man who has spent his whole life expecting to be left, discovering instead that someone might choose to stay. He kissed her then, slow and searching, nothing like the desperate collision of the car ride 3 nights earlier. This was deliberate, reverent, a question asked with lips instead of words, and Claire answered it with her whole body pressed against his, both of them finally, fully done pretending. They didn't make it back inside for another hour, and when they finally did, it was with hands that had learned every line of each other's faces in the dark, with a tenderness that felt entirely at odds with the danger simmering beneath the surface of both their lives. But danger, as it turned out, hadn't forgotten about them. The call came at 3 in the morning, Damien's phone buzzing against the nightstand with an urgency that had him upright and alert before Claire had even fully woken. She watched his face change as he listened, the softness of the last few hours evaporating, replaced by the cold, calculating mask she'd first met the night he'd shown up at her apartment door. When? His voice had gone flat, dangerous. And the shipment? A long pause. No, I'll handle it myself. Have the car ready in 10 minutes. He hung up, and for a moment simply sat on the edge of the bed, spine rigid, staring at nothing. Damien? The Morettis hit one of our warehouses tonight, 2 men dead. It's escalating faster than I anticipated. He turned to look at her, and the tenderness from an hour earlier had been replaced by something harder, more urgent. I need you to stay here, inside the penthouse, with security doubled. I don't know how bad this is going to get, and I can't— He stopped, jaw tight. I can't think clearly if I'm worried about you being anywhere I can't see you. I'm not a china doll, Damien. I can handle— This isn't about what you can handle. His hands framed her face, urgent, almost desperate. This is about what I can survive. And I cannot survive losing you, Claire. Not now. Not after everything we've just— He kissed her, hard and fast, like a man memorizing something he was afraid he might not get to keep. Please, just this once. Stay where I know you're safe. She stayed. She hated herself a little for the relief that came with staying, and hated the war more for making her grateful for a cage, however gilded, however temporary. Damien left before dawn,
and Claire watched from the terrace as his car pulled away into the grey early light, carrying with it a piece of her heart she hadn't fully realised she'd surrendered until it was already gone. She didn't know, standing there in the cold morning air, that it would be the last ordinary morning she'd have for 3 years. The weeks that followed the warehouse attack transformed the penthouse into something closer to a fortress than a home. Security doubled, then tripled. Damien's absences stretched longer, his phone calls more clipped, his face carved deeper each night by exhaustion he refused to admit to. Claire watched the man she'd fallen in love with disappear, piece by piece, into the war he was fighting to keep her safe from it. "You're not sleeping," she said one night, finding him at his desk at 2 a.m, surrounded by documents she wasn't meant to see and didn't ask about. "I sleep enough." "That's not an answer." She crossed the room, resting her hands on his shoulders, feeling the knotted tension there beneath her palms. "Talk to me, please. Whatever this is, you don't have to carry it alone." Damien's hand came up to cover hers, and for a moment he simply sat there, eyes closed, absorbing the small comfort of her touch, like a man starved for exactly this. "The Morettis found out about you," he finally said, voice low. "Not just that I'm married, that the marriage is real now, that I—" He turned to look at her, and the fear in his eyes was raw, unguarded. "That I love you. And love, in this world, is the only currency more valuable than fear. They'll come for you before they come for me again, because they know it's the only wound that would actually break me." "So what do we do?" "I don't know yet." He pulled her down into his lap, arms circling her waist with a desperation that felt almost like grief. "I only know I would burn this entire city to the ground before I let anything happen to you." She believed him. That was the terrifying part. She believed him completely, this man who had built an empire on cold calculation, now willing to torch it all for her sake. The attack, when it came, arrived with the particular cruelty of an ambush disguised as an ordinary afternoon. Claire had insisted on a single shift at St. Augustine's, a small, defiant reclamation of the life she'd had before, one Damien had reluctantly allowed, with a security detail she barely noticed anymore. And it was in the hospital parking garage, of all places, that the world tried to take her. 2 men, faces obscured, moving with the brutal efficiency of professionals rather than opportunists. Claire's training saved her in the first crucial seconds. Instinct honed by years of trauma triage, recognizing danger before her conscious mind could catch up. And she got 3 steps toward the stairwell before a hand closed around her arm, hard enough to bruise. She screamed. Her security detail, 2 men Damien had assigned, without her fully realizing how closely they shadowed her, arrived within seconds, and what followed was brutal, efficient, and over almost before Claire's mind could process it. Gunfire, a body hitting concrete, the second attacker fleeing into the stairwell before he could be stopped. Damien arrived at the hospital 11 minutes later, and Claire would remember for the rest of her life the particular terror on his face as he crossed the ER waiting room, the same waiting room where she had once knelt over his bleeding body and pulled her into arms that shook with a violence she'd never seen from him. "I'm fine," she whispered into his chest, though her own hands hadn't stopped trembling. "Damien, I'm fine." "You are not fine."
His voice was ragged, broken in a way that frightened her more than the attack itself had. "They came for you, in broad daylight, in a building full of witnesses, because they know exactly how much you're worth to me, and they no longer care about the risk of taking you." He pulled back to look at her, cupping her face with hands that weren't entirely steady. "I have to end this, Claire, completely. Not manage it, not contain it. End it. And the way I have to end it—" He stopped, something breaking behind his eyes. "It isn't going to be clean, and you cannot be anywhere near it when it isn't. Damien, whatever you're planning, I love you." The words came out raw, unpracticed, like a man saying something for the first time in his life because he might not get another chance. "I need you to know that before anything else. Whatever happens next, whatever you come to think of me, I have loved you since the night you refused to let me die, and I will love you until the day I actually do." "You're scaring me." "Good," Damien said quietly. "You should be scared. I am." That night, in the dark privacy of their bedroom, they held on to each other with a desperation that felt like goodbye, though Claire didn't yet understand why, and it would be months before she understood that the night that followed, the night that changed everything between them completely, the night that would leave her carrying a piece of Damien Rossi she would raise entirely alone, was also the last night she would spend in his arms for 3 long years. There are nights that exist outside of time. Claire had learned that once, kneeling over a dying stranger in a trauma bay, watching seconds stretch into eternities, measured only by the rhythm of compressions and prayer. This was another one of those nights, though its shape was entirely different. Not desperation to keep death at bay, but desperation to hold on to life while it was still theirs to hold. Damien undressed her slowly, like a man committing scripture to memory, his mouth following the path his hands traced across her skin, murmuring words in Italian she didn't fully understand, but felt in her bones anyway. Reverence. Need. Something that sounded, in any language, like devotion. Every scar on his body, the fresh ones from the shooting, the old ones from a childhood she was only beginning to understand, she traced with fingers that had once, months ago, been slick with his blood, and now learned instead the shape of the life she'd saved. "I've never done this," he admitted, against her throat, voice rough with an honesty that startled her. "Not like this. Not with anyone I actually—" He stopped, breathing unsteady. "I've never let myself want anyone the way I want you." "Then don't stop wanting," Claire whispered, and pulled him down into a kiss that answered every question either of them had been too afraid to ask aloud. What followed was neither gentle nor rushed, but something in between, urgent in the way that two people who understood, on some subconscious level, that time was a currency being stolen from them, even as they spent it, might move together. Damien worshipped her like a man storing memories against a coming famine, and Claire gave herself over entirely, every wall she'd built since the night he'd shown up at her apartment door, finally, completely dissolved. Afterward, tangled together in the dark, Damien held her against his chest with an intensity that bordered on desperation, his heartbeat, the same heartbeat she had once restarted with her own 2 hands, thundering beneath her ear. "Marry me," he murmured into her hair.
Claire laughed softly, still breathless. "I already did." "Marry me again," he said, and there was something almost fragile in his voice, something she wouldn't fully understand the weight of until much later. "For real. Not for protection, not for a bargain. Because I love you, and I want the whole world to know it, whatever it costs me." "Ask me when this war is over," Claire said, tracing lazy patterns across his chest. "Ask me when we're not surrounded by men who want to kill us. I'll say yes every time, Damien. But I want to say it to a man who isn't looking over his shoulder while he asks." He went quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had changed. Lower, heavier, carrying a weight she couldn't name yet. "Whatever happens," he said, "I need you to remember tonight. Whatever you come to think of me, remember this. Remember that this was real. The realest thing I've ever had." "You're talking like you're saying goodbye." "I'm talking like a man who loves someone more than he's ever loved anything else in his life," Damien said, pressing a kiss to her forehead, "and who is more afraid of losing her than he's ever been of dying." She should have pushed harder. She should have demanded to know exactly what he meant, what darkness was crouched behind his eyes that made him speak in half goodbyes, even as he held her close enough to bruise. But exhaustion and love in equal measure pulled her under before she could ask. And when she woke, hours later, to grey morning light bleeding through the curtains, his side of the bed was already cold. She found the note on his pillow first. 3 words, in handwriting she recognised instantly as his, sharp and controlled even in its brevity. "I'm so sorry." And then she found the rest of the penthouse empty. Not just of Damien, but of every trace that he had ever lived there at all. Closets stripped bare, safes emptied, security detail vanished as though they had never existed. Claire stood in the centre of a home that had been, 12 hours earlier, the site of the happiest night of her life, and felt the floor drop out from beneath everything she thought she understood about the man she loved. Her phone rang an hour later. Elena's number, her voice tight with something that sounded almost like grief of her own. "Claire, I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to be strong, because what I'm about to tell you is going to break your heart, and there isn't time for it to break slowly." "Where is he, Elena?" "Gone," Eleanor said, and the word landed like a stone dropped into still water, ripples of devastation spreading outward through every corner of Claire's understanding of her own life. "He's gone, Claire, and I don't know if he's ever coming back." Elena arrived at the penthouse within the hour, and the story she told, piece by devastating piece, rearranged everything Claire thought she understood about the man she'd married. "The Morettis made him an offer," Elena said, sitting across from Claire at the kitchen table, where, days earlier, Damien had learned to make her coffee just the way she liked it. "A truce. Total withdrawal from 3 territories, dissolution of half his operations, in exchange for one condition." "What condition?" Elena's jaw tightened. "That he leave you. Publicly, completely, with no explanation that could be traced back to protect you. They convinced him, and I hate that they were right to convince him, that as long as he was visibly, publicly attached to you, you would remain a target for every enemy he's ever made. The only way to make you safe was to make you appear worthless to him, disposable. A discarded wife nobody would bother killing for leverage because there would be nothing left to leverage." Claire's hands had gone numb around her coffee cup. "He could have told me. We could have found another way." "He tried, Claire. God, he tried everything else first, but the Morettis gave him 48 hours, and every alternative he found led back to you standing in the crossfire. Elena's composure cracked, just slightly, revealing the grief she'd been holding back.
He didn't leave because he stopped loving you. He left because he loved you enough to disappear, rather than watch you die for it. That's the cruelest kind of love this family has ever produced, and I am so sorry you're the one paying for it. Where did he go? I don't know. I'm not supposed to know. That's the point. If I don't know, I can't be tortured into telling anyone, and neither can you. Elena reached across the table, gripping Claire's hand with a fierceness that surprised her. He left you the penthouse, full access to funds, complete legal protection under the Rossi name. You will never want for anything, Claire, except him. And I am so sorry. That's the one thing he couldn't leave you. Claire didn't cry. Not that day. Not in front of Elena, not in the weeks that followed as she moved through the penthouse like a ghost haunting her own life, finding traces of Damien in every corner. A book he'd left half read, a scotch glass with a single ring of amber still dried at the bottom, the scent of him fading slowly from the pillow on his side of the bed, no matter how desperately she tried to preserve it. The tabloids, when the story broke, were merciless. "The Mafia Bride He Couldn't Keep," one headline read, above a photograph of Claire leaving a pharmacy, hollow-eyed and pale, that made her want to burn every newspaper stand in the city. Rossi heir abandons nurse wife after 6-month marriage. The narrative wrote itself, cruel and simple. A poor nurse, seduced by wealth and danger, discarded the moment the novelty wore off. She discovered she was pregnant 6 weeks after Damien disappeared, in the bathroom of an apartment she'd been forced to move into after the lawyers finalized what remained of her legal separation from a marriage that had never officially ended, only evaporated. She sat on the edge of the bathtub, staring at the 2 pink lines on the test in her shaking hands, and felt something inside her break and reassemble itself simultaneously. Grief for the man who would never know, and a fierce, immediate love for the child she was already determined to protect from every shadow that had ever touched its father's world. She told no one. Not Elena, who called occasionally with careful, guarded updates that revealed nothing useful. Not her co-workers at the new hospital she'd transferred to under a different last name, desperate to reclaim some fragment of the ordinary life she'd had before the night a dying man's blood had soaked through her scrubs and changed the trajectory of her entire existence. She raised walls of her own that year, quieter, less dramatic than Damien's, but no less absolute. She stopped reading the tabloids. She stopped hoping for a phone call that never came. She learned to sleep on her own side of an empty bed, to celebrate small victories alone, to build a life around the shape of a man-sized absence that never quite stopped aching, even as the months accumulated into a year, and then 2. By the time her son was born, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, with a scar-shaped birthmark above one eyebrow that made Claire's breath catch every time she looked at him, Damien Rossi had become, in the world's eyes, a ghost story. Vanished. Presumed dead, some whispered, retired to some anonymous corner of the world, others claimed, having finally lost the war that had consumed his entire adult life. Claire named her son Matteo, after no one in particular, and raised him in the quiet, unremarkable corners of a city that had once tried to kill his father. And she told herself every single day that she had made peace with the fact that he would grow up never knowing the man whose eyes he'd inherited. She was wrong about that, too. 3 years to the day after the morning she'd woken to an empty bed and a 3-word note, Damien Rossi walked back into her life, and this time he had come to stay. 3 years is long enough to build an entirely new life on the ruins of an old one. And Claire Bennett, she'd taken her maiden name back legally the day the divorce papers Elena's lawyers drew up finally, mercifully, arrived unsigned by Damien and therefore never finalised, leaving her in a strange legal limbo she'd never bothered to resolve, had built hers with the same discipline she'd once brought to trauma triage. Assess the damage, stop the bleeding, keep moving forward, no matter how much it costs. She worked at a smaller hospital now, in Astoria, close enough to the modest 2-bedroom apartment where she'd raised Matteo alone, far enough from the world that had once tried to devour her that she'd allowed herself, slowly, cautiously, to believe she might have actually escaped it. Matteo was, at 2.5, a small storm of a child. Dark curls that refused every attempt at taming, a laugh that filled rooms twice the size of their apartment, and an intensity in his gaze that unsettled strangers in grocery store lines, the particular watchfulness of a child who seemed, somehow, older than his years. He asked about his father exactly once, at not quite 2, pointing at a man on television and asking, with the blunt curiosity only toddlers possess, "Dada?" Claire had knelt down to his level, throat tight, and said only, "No, baby, your dad's not here right now, but he loved you very much." It was a lie built on faith rather than fact. She had no idea whether Damien even knew Matteo existed, whether he was alive to know anything at all. But it was the only lie she'd allowed herself, and she'd repeated it enough times that some days she almost believed it herself. The nightmares had faded, mostly. The instinct to check locks twice, to note exits in every room she entered, to flinch at black sedans idling too long at curbs, those hadn't faded at all, though she'd learned to carry them quietly, the way you learn to carry any old injury that never fully heals. Elena visited twice a year, always unannounced, always bearing gifts for Matteo, extravagant enough to make Claire wince and never quite refuse. She never spoke of Damien directly, some unspoken agreement between them that his name was a door neither of them was ready to open. But Claire had learned to read the things Elena didn't say as clearly as the things she did. "He's alive," Elena told her once, during a visit when Matteo was 18 months old. The words dropped almost carelessly into a conversation about something else entirely, as though she couldn't help herself. "I shouldn't tell you that, but I won't let you believe otherwise, whatever else happens." "Does he know?" Claire had asked, and hadn't needed to clarify what she meant. Elena's silence had answered the question more clearly than words could have. The night everything changed again began, appropriately, with rain. The same particular quality of downpour that had haunted every significant moment of Claire's association with Damien Rossi, as though the universe had a cruelly consistent sense of atmospheric drama. She was closing out a 12-hour shift, exhausted in the particular way that only trauma nursing produces, when her phone buzzed with a text from her babysitter that made her blood run instantly cold. "There are men outside the apartment. I don't know who they are. Matteo's scared. Please come home." Claire didn't remember the drive home. She remembered arriving to find 2 black sedans parked outside her building, the same make, the same particular quality of expensive menace she hadn't seen in 3 years. Since the last time her world had been invaded by Damien Rossi's shadow, and her heart had seized with a terror so total
It eclipsed even the fear she'd felt the night men had tried to abduct her from a hospital parking garage. She burst through her apartment door to find her babysitter pale and shaking in the kitchen, and Matteo, her sweet, fierce, dark-eyed son, sitting on the living room floor, utterly unharmed, engaged in the world's most improbable staring contest with a man Claire hadn't laid eyes on in 3 long years. Damien Rossi knelt on her living room floor, dressed not in the immaculate suits she remembered, but in simple dark clothes that made him look, somehow, both older and more dangerous than she remembered, staring at the small, dark-haired boy in front of him with an expression Claire had never once seen on his face. Not in 6 months of marriage, not in the raw intimacy of their single night together, not even in the desperate goodbye of a note that had shattered her entire world. He looked terrified. He looked like a man who had just discovered the ground beneath his feet was not solid at all, and had no idea how to keep standing. "Claire," he said, without looking away from Matteo, his voice cracking on her name in a way that undid 3 years of carefully constructed composure in a single syllable. "Why didn't you tell me I had a son?" For a long moment, Claire couldn't speak at all. 3 years of grief, fury, love, and betrayal collided in her chest with such force that she had to grip the doorframe to stay upright. And when she finally found her voice, it came out sharper than she intended, honed by 3 years of raising a fatherless child alone. "Get out of my apartment." Damien rose slowly, and for the first time she saw him fully. The new lines around his eyes, the faint silver threading through his temples that hadn't been there 3 years ago. The particular exhaustion of a man who had aged a decade in the time she'd known only silence from him. "Claire, please, just let me explain." "You had 3 years to explain, Damien. You had a note, 3 words. I'm so sorry. That was the entirety of the explanation I received while I built an entire life out of the wreckage you left behind." Her voice shook, but she didn't stop. 3 years of unspoken fury finally finding its release. "I raised our son alone. I gave birth alone. I sat in a hospital room with no one holding my hand, wondering if you were even alive. And you have the audacity to walk into my home and ask why I didn't tell you." "I didn't know," Damien said, and something in his voice, raw, broken, entirely unlike the controlled man she remembered, made her pause despite herself. "I swear to you, Claire, I didn't know. If I had known—" He stopped, visibly fighting for composure. "I would have found a way back to you the moment I found out, whatever the cost. I have spent 3 years dismantling every last remnant of the Moretti family, piece by piece, precisely so I could come back to you without bringing a war to your doorstep. I didn't know there was a child waiting for me at the end of it." Claire's babysitter, sensing the enormity of what was unfolding, quietly gathered her things and slipped out, leaving Claire alone with the man who had shattered her life and the son who was, at this moment, watching both his parents with the wide, unblinking attention only small children possess. "You need to leave," Claire said again, though the fury in her voice had begun to crack, revealing the exhaustion and grief beneath it. "You don't get to just walk back in." "I'm not asking to walk back into your life on my terms, Claire. I know I don't deserve that." Damien's voice broke on the words, and he took a step closer, close enough that she could see the genuine devastation in his eyes. "I came here tonight because Elena finally told me, after 3 years of my begging her for any scrap of information about you, after 3 years of a war I fought specifically so I could earn the right to come back. She told me about him.
about Matteo. His eyes drifted helplessly back toward the small boy on the floor, who had returned his attention to a set of wooden blocks with the singular focus of a toddler unbothered by adult drama. "I have a son, Claire. I have a son I have missed almost 3 years of, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make that right if you'll let me. But I am not here to force my way back into your bed or your marriage license. I am here because that little boy deserves a father who fights for him, even if his mother never wants to look at me again." The words landed like a blow, and Claire found herself, despite every ounce of fury still burning in her chest, unable to fully deny the sincerity in them. Why now? If you truly ended the war, why did it take you this long to find us? "Because ending a war like the one I was fighting doesn't happen in an afternoon, Claire. It took 3 years of blood and calculated patience to dismantle the Morettis without leaving a single loose thread that could be pulled to find you again. Every month I waited was a month I fought for, so that when I finally did come back, nothing and no one would ever be able to threaten you or—" His voice cracked again, looking at Matteo. "Or him. Ever again." Matteo, apparently deciding the tension in the room had gone on long enough, abandoned his blocks and toddled over to Damien's leg, tugging at his pant leg with the imperious demand of a toddler who has decided an adult requires his attention. "Up," Matteo said, arms raised, the single-word command absolute in its simplicity. Claire watched Damien Rossi, the most feared man in New York's criminal underworld, a man who had dismantled an entire rival empire through 3 years of calculated violence, freeze completely, staring down at the small boy, demanding to be picked up, his composure shattering entirely, slowly, carefully, as though handling something infinitely more fragile than any weapon he'd ever wielded. Damien knelt and lifted his son into his arms for the first time. And Claire, watching the most dangerous man she'd ever known hold their child with a tenderness that broke something open in her chest she'd spent 3 years trying to seal shut, understood that whatever came next, her carefully rebuilt life had just been irrevocably changed all over again. Damien didn't leave that night, though Claire made him sleep on the couch, a small, petty victory she allowed herself in the midst of an evening that had upended everything she thought she understood about her own carefully guarded heart. She watched him from the hallway for longer than she'd admit, sitting on her too small sofa with his knees nearly to his chest, staring at a photograph on her side table. Matteo at 6 months old, gummy smile, dark curls just beginning to come in, with an expression of such naked grief that Claire had to look away, her own anger warring uncomfortably with 3-year-old feelings she'd buried but never managed to kill. In the morning, over coffee, neither of them had the energy to pretend was casual. Damien told her the rest of it, not just what had happened, but why it had taken 3 years, piece by devastating piece. The Morettis didn't just want a truce, he said, his hands wrapped around a mug he wasn't drinking from. They wanted total surrender. My territories, my operations, everything I'd built since my father died. They wanted it dismantled, and they wanted me gone from the city entirely. I refused. So they escalated, and every escalation put you directly in the crossfire, because the one thing they understood, correctly, was that you were the only leverage that would ever actually work against me. So you disappeared to protect me.
I disappeared to give myself the freedom to fight a war I couldn't fight while worrying every single second whether they'd try to reach you again. His jaw tightened. It took 3 years, Claire, because I refused to end it the easy way, the way that would have left half my organization dead and half of theirs dead, and blood in the streets for a decade of retaliation to come. I ended it the way my father should have, methodically, financially, legally where I could manage it. I bled them dry instead of bleeding them out. It took longer, but it meant that when I came back, there would be nothing left of the Morettis capable of ever threatening you or a child I didn't even know existed. And now? Is it really over? Something flickered across his face, not quite hesitation, but the particular caution of a man who has learned, the hard way, not to make promises he isn't certain he can keep. The Morettis, yes, completely. But Claire... He set his coffee down, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her chest tighten. This world doesn't have a finish line. There will always be someone else circling, someone who sees a man with a family as a new kind of weakness to exploit. I won't lie to you about that. What I can promise is that I will never again choose to disappear rather than fight for you. Whatever comes, I fight beside you this time, or not at all. The threat, as it turned out, arrived faster than either of them anticipated. It began with a photograph, anonymous, slipped beneath Claire's apartment door 3 days after Damien's return, showing Matteo at daycare, time-stamped from that very morning, with a single line scrawled across the bottom in handwriting Claire didn't recognize. He has his father's eyes. A shame if something happened to them. Claire's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped her phone calling Damien, who arrived at her apartment within 20 minutes, face carved from stone, the photograph clutched in a grip tight enough to crumple the edges. Anthony Vitali, he said, once Elena had run the handwriting analysis, her expression grim. He's been circling since the Morettis fell, scavenging their territory, absorbing what's left of their operation. I should have anticipated this. Vultures always find the carcass, eventually. He propositioned me, at the Vesper, years ago. Claire's memory of that night, Anthony's easy smile, his roving eyes, Damien's barely restrained fury, resurfaced with a clarity that made her stomach turn. He wants revenge for how you humiliated him that night. He wants leverage, Damien corrected grimly, and now he has exactly the leverage he needs. He turned to Claire, and the fear in his eyes was raw, unguarded, entirely unlike the composed monster the tabloids had once painted him as. I need you and Matteo somewhere safe, not the penthouse, too obvious, too exposed. I have a property upstate, secure, defensible. I need you both there tonight. Damien, I have a job, a life I built. You have a son whose photograph just arrived with a threat attached to it, Damien said, and the desperate edge in his voice silenced her objection instantly. Please, Claire, I am asking you, not commanding you. I promised myself I would never again make that mistake with you, but I am begging you to let me protect the both of you, this time together. Claire looked at her son, oblivious to the danger circling him, playing contentedly with a set of measuring cups on her kitchen floor, and felt 3 years of careful independence collide, finally, irrevocably, with the terrifying reality that some dangers required more than one person's strength to survive. "Okay," she said, "we'll go. But this time, Damien, this time you don't get to disappear on me again. Whatever happens next, we face it together, or not at all." Something in his expression cracked open. Relief, gratitude, love, all tangled together into an expression that made her chest ache with 3 years of grief finally beginning, cautiously, to heal. Together, Damien agreed. I swear it. The property upstate was nothing like the penthouse Claire remembered. No glass towers, no city lights glittering below. Only dense forest and a stone farmhouse retrofitted with security systems sophisticated enough to make Claire's skin prickle every time she noticed another discreet camera tucked into the eaves. Matteo, blessedly oblivious to the danger that had prompted their sudden relocation, treated the move as an Aden, delighting in the wide fields and the small pond behind the house, and Claire found herself grateful, in the midst of her fear, for the particular resilience of small children who trust that their parents will keep the world's darkness at bay. The nights were harder. Claire lay awake in a bedroom she'd been given at the opposite end of the house from Damien's, an echo, deliberate or not, of the very first night of their marriage, when he'd shown her to a room with locks on the inside and promised never to cross the threshold uninvited, and found herself, more nights than not, walking the hallway toward his door before she'd fully decided to. It was Elena, arriving 3 days into their stay, with intelligence gathered from sources Claire didn't ask too many questions about, who finally forced the confrontation both Claire and Damien had been circling since his return. Anthony Vitali isn't acting alone, Elena said, spreading photographs across the farmhouse's kitchen table with the brisk efficiency of a woman accustomed to delivering bad news. He's found backing. Remnants of the Moretti family who escaped Damien's dismantling, along with at least 2 other families who see an opportunity in a Rossi weakened by a public family. How weakened? Damien asked, jaw tight. Weak enough that they're planning something more direct than photographs and threats. Elena's expression was grim. My sources suggest an attempt on the house itself, within the week. They know where you are, Damien. Someone talked. The colour drained from Claire's face. Matteo, we'll be protected with every resource I have, Damien said immediately, gripping her hand with a fierceness that spoke louder than any promise. I will not let anything happen to him, or to you. I would burn every alliance I have left before I let that happen. That night, unable to sleep, unable to bear the terror pressing in on her chest alone, Claire finally crossed the hallway she'd been avoiding for 3 days and knocked on Damien's door. He opened it instantly, as though he'd been waiting, expecting her, and the sight of him, shirtless, exhausted, dark circles beneath eyes that hadn't stopped scanning for threats since the moment they'd arrived, nearly undid her resolve to keep some distance between them. I'm scared, she admitted, the words costing her more than she expected. Not for myself, for him. I don't know how to protect him from a world I never asked to be part of. You already have, Damien said quietly, pulling her into the room, into arms that closed around her with a desperate tenderness that made her chest ache. Every single day, for 3 years, you protected him from a world that didn't even know he existed. That is more than most people in my life have ever managed. You are not helpless, Claire. You are the strongest person I have ever known. Then why does it feel like I'm drowning? Because fear doesn't care how strong you are, Damien murmured against her hair. It only cares that you love something enough to be terrified of losing it. I know that fear intimately. I have lived inside it for 3 years, wondering if I'd made the right choice leaving you, wondering if you'd ever forgive me, wondering if I'd ever get the chance to meet a son I didn't know I had.
His arms tightened. But I am done running from it, Claire. I am done letting fear dictate distance. Whatever happens with Vitale, whatever comes next, I want to face it beside you. Not for you, beside you. She looked up at him, and 3 years of grief and love and unresolved longing collided in a single, unguarded moment. And this time, when she kissed him, there was none of the desperate urgency of their first night together, none of the frantic collision of two people racing against a war neither of them controlled. This was slower, surer. A promise renewed between two people who had survived the worst that separation could do to them and chosen, deliberately, to try again. "I never stopped loving you," Claire whispered against his mouth. "Even when I hated you. Even when I thought you were dead. Some stubborn part of me never let go." "I don't deserve that," Damien said, forehead pressed to hers. "But I am going to spend every day I have left trying to earn it anyway." Outside, the forest surrounding the farmhouse rustled with wind, and somewhere beyond the tree line, unseen and unheard, the first scouts of Anthony Vitale's assault force began their slow, patient approach. And neither Claire nor Damien, wrapped in a fragile reunion neither had dared hope for, yet understood how close the coming storm truly was. It began at 3 a.m., the same treacherous hour that had once brought Claire the phone call that ended her first marriage to Damien. And this time it began with the farmhouse's security system erupting into a cascade of alarms that jolted the entire household awake in the same instant. "Perimeter breach, east side," Damien's head of security barked into a radio, already moving through the house with the brutal efficiency of a man who had trained for exactly this scenario. "Multiple hostiles, at least 8, maybe more." Damien was out of bed and pulling on clothes before Claire had even fully processed the words, his composure snapping into the cold, lethal focus she remembered from the first night he'd walked into her apartment. Except now, there was nothing composed about the fear in his eyes as he turned to her. "Get Matteo. The panic room, now. Elena will take you both there. I need to coordinate the defense." "Damien, please, Claire." His hands found her face, urgent, desperate. "I need to know you're both safe, so I can think clearly. Please." She ran. Matteo scooped up, half asleep and confused in her arms, following Elena down a hidden staircase behind what Claire had assumed was simply a linen closet, into a reinforced room beneath the farmhouse, stocked with supplies for exactly this kind of siege. The door sealed behind them with a heavy, mechanical finality that made Claire's chest constrict with claustrophobic terror. "He'll be all right," Elena said, though her own hands were shaking as she checked the room's monitor feeds, showing grainy night vision footage of armed men moving through the tree line toward the house. "He's the best I've ever seen at this. He's survived worse odds." "Has he?" Elena's silence was answer enough. Above them, the sounds of gunfire began, distant at first, then closer, punctuated by shouted commands and the particular chaos of violence Claire recognized, viscerally, from years of treating its aftermath in trauma bays, though she had never before been forced to listen to it happening in real time, powerless to help, her son clutched against her chest and crying now, finally aware that something was deeply wrong. The siege lasted 11 minutes. It felt to Claire like 11 years. When the all-clear finally came, Elena's radio crackling with Damien's voice, rough with exertion, but alive, blessedly alive, Claire nearly collapsed with relief. and it was all she could do to hold Matteo steady as Elena led them back up through the hidden staircase into a farmhouse transformed by violence. Shattered windows, scorched walls where incendiary devices had failed to fully ignite, and Damien, standing in the centre of it all, blood on his hands that wasn't entirely his own, his eyes searching frantically for her the moment she emerged. "Claire!" He crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling her and Matteo both into arms that shook with the aftermath of violence and terror in equal measure. "You're safe. Thank God. You're safe." "Anthony," Claire managed, still trembling. "Was he—" "Dead," Damien said flatly, and something in his voice made clear the personal satisfaction he took in that fact, however much it contradicted the man who had once told her he found violence exhausting rather than gratifying. He led the assault himself, overconfident. It cost him everything. And the others? Scattered, broken, without Vitali's backing to hold them together. Damien pulled back just enough to look at her face, at Matteo's tear-streaked cheeks pressed against her shoulder, and something fierce and protective blazed in his eyes. "It's over, Claire. I mean that completely this time. Not a truce, not a temporary peace bought with my absence. Over." In the days that followed, as the farmhouse was repaired and the last remnants of Vitali's scattered alliance were hunted down and neutralized by resources Claire chose deliberately not to ask too many questions about, something settled between Claire and Damien that had never fully existed before. Not in the desperate early days of their fake marriage, not even in the single stolen night that had given them Matteo. A quiet certainty. The particular peace of 2 people who had fought together this time for something worth keeping, and won. Matteo, remarkably resilient in the way small children often are, recovered from the terror of that night faster than either of his parents, delighting within days in the novelty of a father who now seemed determined never to let him out of arm's reach, carrying him on his shoulders through the farmhouse's repaired hallways, teaching him, with a patience Claire hadn't fully expected from a man once defined entirely by ruthlessness, to stack blocks and identify farm animals in a picture book Elena had brought as a gift. "You're good with him," Claire observed one evening, watching Damien read Matteo a bedtime story with theatrical enthusiasm that made their son shriek with delighted laughter. "I'm terrified with him," Damien corrected, not looking up from the book. "Every single day. I keep waiting to wake up and discover this was a dream I don't deserve to have." He finally looked up at her, something achingly vulnerable in his expression. "I miss so much, Claire. His first steps, his first words. I will spend the rest of my life trying to make up for that, and I know I never fully can." "Then don't try to make up for it," Claire said softly, settling onto the bed beside them. "Just be here now. That's enough. That's more than enough." Winter arrived at the farmhouse with a hush that felt, after the violence of the siege, almost sacred. Snow blanketing the fields where Matteo had once chased butterflies, the pond frozen solid enough that Damien, to Claire's initial terror, insisted on teaching their son to skate on a small cleared patch near the shore. The city called them back eventually. Damien's operations, legitimate now in ways Claire hadn't expected, required his presence, and Claire herself, after months away, found herself missing the particular satisfaction of trauma nursing enough that she quietly began researching positions at hospitals closer to the penthouse Damien had, apparently, never actually sold.
"You kept it," she said, the first time she stepped back into the apartment where she'd once woken to an empty bed and a three-word note that had shattered her world. "I couldn't bring myself to let it go," Damien admitted, watching her from the doorway with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Even when I thought I'd never see you again, it felt like the last place I'd ever truly been happy, and I wasn't ready to erase that, even in grief." Claire moved through the rooms slowly, finding them changed in small ways. New furniture in places she remembered differently. A child's room she hadn't expected, already painted a soft, hopeful yellow, waiting for a son Damien hadn't known existed until weeks earlier. "You prepared this, before you even knew about Matteo." "I prepared it hoping someday we might have children together. Foolish, I know, given how things ended." Damien's voice had gone rough. "I never stopped hoping, Claire, even during the worst of it, even when I convinced myself you'd hate me forever, and rightly so." She turned to face him, 3 years of grief and anger finally fully processed into something gentler, something that looked, increasingly, like forgiveness, freely given rather than grudgingly extracted. "I don't hate you, Damien. I spent a long time trying to. It never quite took. I don't deserve that grace. Maybe not." Claire crossed the room, taking his hands in hers. "But I'm giving it to you anyway. Because Matteo deserves a father who fights for him. And I—" She paused, gathering courage for words she'd been holding back for weeks, uncertain whether she was ready to say them aloud. "I deserve a husband who chooses to stay, even when staying is hard, even when the world tries to make staying cost him everything." Damien's composure, so carefully maintained through months of war and reconciliation, finally cracked entirely. He pulled her against him, burying his face in her hair, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion she'd rarely heard from him, even in their most intimate moments. "Marry me," he said, again. For real this time, not for protection, not for a bargain forced by circumstance, a real wedding, Claire. One where I stand in front of everyone who matters and tell the truth about how much I love you, without a single lie buried in the ceremony. "You already asked me that once," Claire said, though her eyes had filled with tears. "The night before you disappeared." "I know. And I broke that promise before I ever got the chance to keep it." Damien pulled back, meeting her eyes with a fierce, desperate sincerity. "Let me keep it this time. Let me stand in front of the world and marry the woman who saved my life twice over, once with her hands in a trauma bay, and once with her heart, by choosing to forgive a man who didn't deserve a second chance." Claire laughed through her tears, the sound surprising her with its lightness after months of fear and grief. "Yes," she said, "God help me, yes. Again." The wedding, when it finally happened in early spring, bore no resemblance to the tense, transactional ceremony that had bound them together 3 years earlier. Elena stood as maid of honour this time, tears streaming unashamedly down her face throughout the entire ceremony. Nico did not attend. Claire learned, without asking too many questions, that his ambitions had finally caught up with him in ways that left him permanently unable to threaten anyone ever again. A fate she chose not to examine too closely. Grateful only that whatever justice had found him, it had left her family safe. Matteo, 3 years old now, and thoroughly unbothered by the solemnity expected of him, insisted on carrying the rings himself, toddling up the aisle with fierce concentration, and the entire chapel dissolved into laughter when he refused to hand the small velvet pillow to anyone but his father, declaring with imperious 3-year-old authority, "Mine job, mine ring." Damien knelt to take the rings from his son, and something in the moment, this dangerous, formerly untouchable man, kneeling before a toddler with tears openly visible in his eyes, undid the last of Claire's composure entirely, and she found herself crying through her own vows, through the kiss that sealed them, through the entire reception that followed, tears of a grief finally, completely resolved into joy.
"No more disappearing," she whispered against his lips as their first dance began, Matteo asleep against Elena's shoulder nearby, exhausted from an afternoon of unrestrained celebration. "No more disappearing," Damien agreed, holding her close, his voice thick with the particular gravity of a vow he intended to keep for the rest of his life. "I promise you, Claire, whatever comes next, we face it together. Always." The years that followed unfolded with a quiet ordinariness that Claire had once believed was permanently beyond her reach, a life measured not in danger and desperate midnight confrontations, but in the small, accumulating joys of a family finally allowed to simply exist. Damien's transition away from the world that had once defined him wasn't instantaneous, nor was it ever entirely complete. Some habits, he admitted to her one evening, several years into their renewed marriage, could never be fully unlearned, only managed. He still checked exits in every room he entered. He still kept a careful, watchful eye on any stranger who lingered too long near his family. But the empire he'd inherited from his father transformed, gradually, into something closer to legitimate business. Real estate, hospitality, investments in the kind of ventures that didn't require armed men at every entrance. "I want him to grow up in a world where he never has to learn the things I had to learn," Damien told Claire one night, watching Matteo, 5 years old now, still fierce, still watchful in ways that occasionally worried her, chase Elena's twin daughters around the penthouse's private terrace garden, shrieking with laughter that echoed off the glass towers surrounding them. "I don't know if that's entirely possible, given the name he carries, but I intend to try." "He has something you didn't have," Claire said, leaning into his side, watching their son's uncomplicated joy with a fierce protectiveness of her own. "Two parents who chose each other deliberately, in the light. Not out of obligation, not out of fear, just love." "Because you saved my life," Damien said, turning to press a kiss to her temple. "And then you saved it again, by forgiving me for the worst decision I ever made. I don't know how to repay a debt like that." "You don't repay it," Claire said, smiling up at him. "You just keep choosing to stay. That's the whole payment, every single day." St. Augustine's, the hospital where Claire had once knelt over a dying stranger and unknowingly changed the entire trajectory of her life, invited her back for a fundraising gala 2 years after her second wedding, an event Damien, quietly and without her knowledge until the invitation arrived, had anonymously funded a new trauma wing in honour of. Claire discovered the plaque only the night of the gala itself, tucked in a corridor near the very trauma bay where she'd once saved his life. In honour of the nurse who taught a dangerous man the true price of a second chance. She found him afterward, standing near the window of the hospital's new wing, watching the city lights with the particular stillness she'd once found so unnerving, and now found only achingly familiar. "You didn't have to do that,"
she said, joining him at the window. I wanted to. Damien's arm came around her waist, pulling her close. I wanted this place, the place where everything started, to remember what you did for me. Not just for my sake, but for every patient who walks through those doors after us, terrified and broken, who might need someone brave enough to fight for their life, even when the cost of that fight is unknown. Claire rested her head against his shoulder, watching the same skyline she'd once stared at in fear, in grief, in desperate hope, and felt, finally, entirely at peace with the strange, dangerous, extraordinary path that had led her here. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "That night, everything that came after?" Damien was silent for a long moment, considering the question with the same gravity he brought to every decision that mattered to him. "I regret the pain I caused you," he finally said. "I regret every day I spent away from you and Matteo, every moment I let fear convince me that disappearing was love rather than cowardice dressed up in noble language. But the rest of it—" He turned to face her fully, cupping her face with hands that had once, so long ago, been slick with his own blood on a hospital gurney. "The rest of it, I would choose again in an instant. Every danger, every impossible decision, because it led me to you, and to him, and to a life I never once believed a man like me deserved to have." Claire kissed him then, slow and certain, in the same hospital corridor where their entire impossible story had begun, and felt the last remaining shadows of fear and grief finally completely dissolve into something that could only be called happiness. There is a particular kind of peace that only arrives after survival. Not the absence of danger, but the accumulated proof, year after year, that danger no longer defines the shape of a life. Claire found herself, in the years that followed, discovering that peace in the smallest, most ordinary moments. Matteo's first day of kindergarten, his small hand gripping hers tightly at the school gate before he squared his shoulders, so like his father's, that particular gesture of gathering courage, and marched inside without looking back. Damien teaching him to ride a bicycle in Central Park on a Sunday morning, running alongside him with a devotion that made strangers smile at the sight of a man clearly, helplessly in love with his own child. The last echo of Damien's old world arrived, unexpectedly, on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday evening, nearly 4 years after Matteo's birth. Elena arrived at the penthouse without calling ahead, a habit Claire had learned to associate over the years with news too significant for a phone call, and found Claire and Damien in the kitchen, Matteo doing math homework at the counter, with the particular seriousness he brought to everything. "It's over," Elena said without preamble, and something in her voice made both Claire and Damien go still. Completely. The last of the old families, the ones who might have ever posed a threat to any of us, signed a formal peace accord this afternoon. Recognized by everyone who matters in this world. No more claims, no more grudges, no more shadows from the past reaching for any of us. Damien set down the dish towel he'd been holding, and Claire watched something in him, some final, deeply buried tension he'd carried for years without ever fully naming it, release completely. "It's really over," he repeated, as though testing the words for their truth. "Really over," Elena confirmed, smiling for the first time since she'd arrived. "You did it, Damien. You actually did it. A legitimate peace, built to last, instead of a temporary truce paid for with someone's blood.
She glanced at Matteo, still bent studiously over his homework, oblivious to the magnitude of what had just been decided in the kitchen around him. He gets to grow up in a world that has finally, completely let go of his father's past. That night, once Matteo was asleep, Claire found Damien on the terrace, the same spot where he'd once confessed the story of his father's death, the origin of every wall he'd built around himself in the years since. He was crying, quietly, almost silently, the particular grief of a man finally allowed to release a burden he'd carried since he was 19 years old, watching his father die on a sidewalk, 2 blocks from where they now stood. "I kept waiting for something to go wrong," he admitted, when Claire wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her cheek against his back. "Every single day since Matteo was born, I kept waiting for the other consequence to arrive. For someone to come for you, or him, the way they came for you before. I don't know how to exist in a world where that isn't the primary fear governing every decision I make." "Then learn," Claire said gently, turning him to face her. "The way I learnt to trust you again. The way Matteo learnt to love a father he'd never met before he was 3 years old. It takes time, Damien, but it's possible. I promise you, it's possible." "You saved my life twice," Damien said, echoing words Claire had heard from him before, though they landed with new weight now, years into a marriage that had survived everything the world could throw against it. "Once in that trauma bay, with your hands, and once here, in this life, by choosing to let me back in after I broke your heart so completely I thought it might never heal." "It healed because you came back and fought for it," Claire said. "That's the part that matters, Damien. Not that you left, that you came back, and you kept coming back every single day since." He kissed her then, slow and reverent, the kind of kiss that carried within it every year of struggle and every year of hard-won peace. And somewhere inside the penthouse, their son slept soundly, safe in a world his parents had bled and fought and sacrificed to build for him. A world finally, completely free of the shadows that had once threatened to consume them both. "Marry me," Damien murmured against her lips, the old joke between them now, worn smooth with years of affection. "I keep telling you," Claire laughed softly. "I already did. Twice." "Then let me ask a third time," Damien said, pulling back to look at her with an intensity that had never dimmed, not once, in all their years together. "Not because I need to, because I want to spend the rest of my life asking you that question, every single day, and hearing you say yes." "Yes," Claire whispered, pulling him back down into a kiss that tasted like every hard year that had led them here, and every easy year still waiting ahead. "Always yes, Damien, for the rest of our lives." 10 years after a rain-soaked ambulance bay changed the trajectory of 2 lives forever, Claire Rossi stood in the doorway of Street, Augustine's newly expanded trauma wing, watching a class of first-year nursing students shadow the current shift with the particular nervous energy she remembered vividly from her own early career. She still worked there, part-time now, teaching more than treating, though she never fully gave up the hands-on satisfaction of trauma nursing that had first drawn her to the profession. The particular sacred privilege of refusing with your own 2 hands to let death win. Matteo, 13 now, tall for his age with his father's dark hair and his mother's steady gaze, had recently developed an interest in medicine that made Claire's heart swell every time he asked about her work,
peppering her with questions about anatomy and trauma protocols that suggested perhaps the family's future might hold a very different kind of legacy than the one his father had once carried.
Damien had built something extraordinary from the ashes of his old empire. A network of legitimate businesses, yes, but also, quietly, without ever seeking credit for it, a foundation dedicated to funding trauma centres in underserved neighbourhoods across the city, each one carrying some small tribute to the woman who had once saved his life, and in doing so, taught him what it meant to actually deserve saving. They had a daughter now, too, Sophia, 7 years old, fierce and stubborn in ways that made both her parents laugh at the reflection of themselves in her. Born 4 years after Matteo, into a marriage that had by then weathered every storm the world could throw at it, and emerged each time stronger for the surviving. On the 10th anniversary of the night Damien Rossi had first walked into Claire Bennett's apartment and upended the entire trajectory of her carefully ordinary life, the family gathered at the farmhouse upstate, the same property where they had once weathered a violent siege, now transformed entirely into a place of celebration rather than fear, its fields blooming with the particular abundance of late summer, the pond where Matteo had first learned to skate, now home to a small dock where both children spent entire afternoons fishing with a patience that mirrored their father's own. "Do you ever think about that night?" Damien asked, finding Claire on the farmhouse porch as the sun set over the fields, their children's laughter drifting up from the pond, where Elena's now teenage daughters had joined them for an impromptu game of tag. "Every year," Claire admitted, leaning into the arm he wrapped around her shoulders. "I think about how close I came to walking away from that trauma bay without ever looking back. How different everything might have been if I'd let someone else handle you. If I hadn't been the one whose hands happened to be free that night." "I think about it too," Damien said quietly. "More than you know. I think about how many times in that first year we were married I could have destroyed everything by pushing you away sooner, by never letting myself feel what I felt for you. I think about how close I came to losing all of this." He gestured toward the pond, toward their children, toward the whole quiet, hard-won piece of the life they'd built together. "Out of fear that I didn't deserve to have it." "But you didn't push me away," Claire said, turning to face him fully. "You came back. Every single time the world tried to convince you that leaving was love, you eventually found your way back to the truth, that staying, fighting, choosing us again and again was the only version of love that actually meant anything." "You taught me that," Damien said, his voice thick with an emotion that had never fully faded, not in 10 years of marriage, not in a decade of learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to be the husband and father he'd once believed himself incapable of becoming. "You taught me that a man could be dangerous and still choose gentleness, that he could carry an entire empire of violence on his shoulders and still learn how to be soft enough for a child to trust him completely." "I don't know who I would have become without you, Claire. I don't think I want to know." "You would have survived," Claire said softly. "You always survive. But I don't think you would have lived. Not really. Not like this." Damien pulled her into his arms, and together they watched their children in the golden evening light. Matteo teaching Sophia how to cast a fishing line with the same patient concentration his father had once used to teach him to ride a bicycle. Both of them laughing at some private joke that would remain forever entirely their own. "I love you," Damien murmured into her hair, the words as fresh and true as they had been the first time he'd said them.
terrified and unguarded in the aftermath of an attack that had nearly cost them everything.
I have loved you since the moment I opened my eyes in that hospital bed and understood somehow, in some way I couldn't fully explain, that the woman who'd refused to let me die was going to change the entire course of my life. I love you too, Claire said, and meant it with the same complete, unguarded certainty that had once terrified her all those years ago, standing at her apartment window with a stranger's silhouette burned into her memory, choosing, against every instinct for self-preservation she possessed, to say yes to a dangerous man's impossible bargain. The price of silence, she thought, watching her children's laughter carry across the water in the fading light, had turned out to be nothing at all like what she'd once feared. It hadn't cost her everything. It had, in the end, given her everything. A family built from danger and healed by choice. A love that had survived betrayal and distance and fear. And a life that neither of them, on that first rain-soaked night in a trauma bay a decade ago, could ever have imagined they'd be lucky enough to share. "Race you to the dock," Damien said suddenly, breaking the moment with a grin that still, after 10 years, made her heart skip in a way she suspected it always would. "You're on," Claire laughed, and together they ran down through the golden fields toward their children, toward the water, toward a future that belonged finally and completely, entirely, to them.